Hey, good morning, everyone. How are you today? This is Through the Looking Glass. I'm your host, Dennison. We're here Mondays from 9 to 10 a.m. here on the great community radio, WIOX 91.3 FM in the Catskill Mountains. We have another tremendous show today. This one is especially close to my heart. Author of the book, What the Nurses Saw, Ken McCarthy, speaking to nurses who lived through the COVID event in the hospitals, witnessed some things that were very disturbing for them, incredibly disturbing, and cost many of them their jobs, their licenses, their careers, because they spoke up when they saw things they knew was not right after years and years of experience in the hospital. So we have someone who's an expert on this. This is Ken McCarthy. Ken is a New Yorker. He's not too far away from where we are in the Catskill Mountains. He's got a bunch of books he's written. He's a really tremendous author and researcher. He's written a book, The Nuremberg Codes, The Unraveling the COVID Con, Dr. Fauci's First Fraud, about the HIV crisis, which, as we've talked about in this show, very similar to what happened with COVID. And his new book, What the Nurses Saw. Ken McCarthy, what a pleasure to have you on. Thanks for coming here.
Well, thanks for having me.
I wonder if you could just start out with, how did you first get onto this topic? Unveiling the COVID con, Fauci's first fraud. Certainly in the 80s, Fauci was manipulating health policy to the benefit of big pharma and to the detriment of AIDS patients, but really millions of people across the globe. But maybe you can just start off with your genesis into this area, because I know you were an internet guru for a while.
That's true. In the early 90s, I was one of the original people in that. It's such a long story, but there's somebody that we both know, Gary Null, and I grew up in the 1980s in New York City, listening to Gary Null, and of course he was one of the great pioneers of exposing the HIV equals AIDS equals certain horrible death fraud.
Yes, he was.
Yeah, and real courageous, by the way. I mean, it's a lot easier to talk about it now today than it was in the 1980s. So that planted the seed in my mind. And then COVID came, and then I've had my own experiences with the medical system, as I'm sure all of your listeners have, and I bet a bunch of them have not been pleasant or effective. And so then when COVID came along, I smelled a rat right away. In fact, I to my still frozen Twitter channel, my Twitter channel has not been, I can't post to it since March 2021. But on February 1st of that year, of 2020, before it came to America, COVID supposedly, I said this is a vaccine marketing exercise. They're going to try to use it to develop a coronavirus vaccine, and they're going to use more speed than science. That was February 1st, 2020. Kind of a lucky, it wasn't a lucky guess. It was an educated guess. But I, of course, like you and I'm sure everybody else, I had no idea how far they would take it.
Right.
Obviously, it went from the 2-week pause, which seemed insane, to the multi-year pause, to the coerced vaccinations, to the lying about the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people who've been injured by these vaccines. But there's another element to the story that I think you'll agree got missed, which is the mayhem that took place in hospitals during COVID. Mm-hmm. And I was first made aware of it by Erin Olszewski, a registered nurse from Florida, who had gone up to New York City to work as a contract nurse. And she was absolutely horrified by what she saw going on. And I paid a lot of attention to it. I initially assumed this was about, when was this, May, June 2020. So just to remind everybody of the chronology, so the shutdown started May, around, I think it was on St. Patrick's Day of 2020. Mm-hmm. And people were, the hospitals were all closed, and all kinds of craziness was going on. And it went on, as people remember, for months and months and months. When I heard her story, it rung true because I've had experience with New York City hospitals, both the city-run hospitals, which are an abomination, and the private hospitals, which really aren't much better. So I hate to say it, but I would believe anything about malfeasance going on in those hospitals and incompetence. And so I filed that away, and then I kept up with her, and then I decided to do an in-depth interview with her because there were a lot of things that came through the media that I had questions about. So we were on the phone for hours, and I filed that away. And then I interviewed a fellow who's a PhD in nursing with 40-plus years experience, who's a nursing educator over in the UK. And he came at it from a different angle, talking about how this was not just a problem caused by a panic. It was systemic. It was taking place in England throughout all the hospitals. Now, England has a different system than us. They have the National Health Service. So basically, all medicine comes from one source. So when things go wrong, they go wrong system-wide. And he was saying, from his viewpoint, and again, this is a 40-plus year veteran nurse with a PhD in education, educator of nurses. He said it looked like they were just using this to get rid of expensive patients, sick and elderly patients. And I did an in-depth interview with him, and I filed that away. And I assumed, okay, you introduced me as a researcher and a writer, and it's true, I have researched and written books, but it's not my main thing in life. I have other things that I work on. And so I was hoping somebody else would write a book on this subject. And 2020 passed and nothing came out. 2021, 2022, we got to be the middle of 2023, and I realized no one's going to talk about this. So I got back with Erin, and she connected me with lots of nurses all over the country, and I started interviewing them, and I realized this was not something that occurred as a result of a panic. This is something that, in a limited place like New York City, this is something that happened all over the United States. And, it's a dark thing. But basically, what is this that I'm talking about? What they did was they changed the laws and rules of medicine radically over COVID. If you were to be diagnosed as a positive COVID case, and that would be a result of one of these highly unreliable tests, all normal laws of medicine were suspended, and you were put into a sort of an alternative reality. So anybody that showed up at a hospital was ill enough to go to the hospital, who then tested positive for COVID, was put into this alternate universe. And just to show you how crazy it was, the first law was that you were not allowed to have any anti-inflammatory drugs, even ibuprofen.
For a very inflammatory illness, it doesn't make any sense.
Right. And we're not talking about something controversial or something untested or something new. This is as common as if you got a cut, you wash it and put a Band-Aid on. There's nothing controversial about giving people anti-inflammatories when they have an inflammatory problem. There's also another series of remedies for lung distress, inhalable steroids. And again, they're not controversial, not new, extremely well established, as common as putting a Band-Aid on a cut. And if you were deemed a COVID patient, you were also denied the anti-inflammatories, the inhalable anti-inflammatory steroids, the inhalable steroids.
And these are what asthma patients live with, basically.
Yeah. You actually, which raises this interesting issue. A whole lot of people showed up at the hospital with things other than COVID. But if they also happen to get a positive COVID test, whatever else problem they had, they were not treated for. They were just treated for, quote, COVID. And I put COVID in quotes because, clearly people get sick. Clearly people get serious respiratory problems. There seems to be some genetic artifacts that go along with that. But there were people being. We'll talk about the extremity of these treatments in a second. But there were people with very modest problems that could have been resolved very easily that were put into the equivalent of a medical meat grinder, just based on these very unreliable tests. And the parallel back to the HIV equals AIDS equals certain miserable deaths. They were testing everybody. I remember even as late as 2000, I couldn't get life. And I'm just a normal guy. I couldn't get life insurance without having an HIV test. Mm-hmm. So they were testing everybody. They were encouraging people to test themselves frequently. And it turns out those tests were completely bogus.
And, we know that because, and I've said this on the air many times, the creator of the test, Kary Mullis, who won a Nobel Prize for its ability to find genetic material in remnant form, said you can never use this as treatment. You can never use this to diagnose a patient. This is absolutely not what it's for. And he died just before the pandemic began, and a lot of people scratch their heads with that. But without his voice there, the PCR test was transformed into Sherlock Holmes of viruses, right? It's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, the PCR technology is designed specifically to rapidly amplify the presence of genetic material, and it was meant to assist research. So, in other words, if you needed to test something the old-fashioned way, you'd have to wait for nature to take its course to double and then double again, and it just takes time. But with this technology that Mullis came up with, by the way, he won the Nobel Prize for it, so this is not some fringe dude. You could rapidly take even the most minute genetic fragment and multiply it. So it was never meant to be a diagnostic. It's crazy to be a diagnostic. Before COVID, a couple of years before COVID, they did a test on the New York subways, and they sort of swabbed everything and tested everything they found. And they literally found every disease known to man on the subway, like stuff from Africa, stuff. But it was in such small quantities, and most people's immune systems are strong enough to throw off minor things that, it wasn't considered a big deal. But the point is, you can find anything anywhere, and if you've got PCR technology, you can amplify it to give the appearance of a raging infection, and that's what they did. PCR is based on cycles, and the more cycles you run, the more you amplify the genetic material you're looking for. So some states were doing 20 cycles, some states were doing 30, some states were doing 40. And I mean, you could probably, if you did enough PCR cycles, find bubonic plague on your desk. I don't want to freak anybody out, but genetic material and biological material moves around. It doesn't, it's not contained.
And that is the concern, too, because, sorry to interrupt, but if you have, let's say you've had a coronavirus in the past, that genetic material is still there, your immune system has knocked it out, but it's just beat up fragments that they're magnifying, saying now you've got a disease when you don't. Or maybe you have it, but you've already kind of just knocked it out. It's been so weak, your immune system's robust, it's not going to develop into symptoms, you're not going to be contagious. And yet, suddenly this new test dictated the pathway, didn't it?
That's absolutely, and they did the same exact fraud they did with AIDS. If you remember back in the AIDS era,
oh yes,
they talked about non-systematic supercarriers. In other words, you're perfectly well, you don't have a single sign of disease, but your very existence in the world puts the whole rest of the world at risk. This is not how infectious disease works. This is not how medicine works. This is not how science works. It is literally a voodoo, and even Kary Mullis used that expression, black magic, voodoo thinking. Mm-hmm. People get sick with infectious diseases. You used to talk about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, right? Mm-hmm. Well, it starts with war, then it goes to famine. And then after war and all that stress and all that lack of nutrients, that's when the plague plague comes. Mm-hmm. People who are their immune systems are beat down for one reason or another are more likely to get sick, And people whose immune systems are robust are likely not to get sick, or if they do catch something, they throw it off very quickly. So to take this, to misuse this PCR test and use it as evidence, to use Fauci's favorite phrase, an active infection, there's no such thing. It just means they found some genetic material in your system.
It worked. It worked in Salem in the 1600s, didn't it?
Well, I mean, it was very much. It is really no difference psychologically between this and the Salem witch hunts. And what we now know about that bogus HIV test, and I keep bringing that up because that stuff has been studied to the nth degree at this point. We now know beyond a shadow of a doubt every detail of it, and there are over 100 different ways to trigger a positive HIV test that have nothing to do with the syndrome.
I heard even pregnancy could trigger it.
Yes, pregnancy. I mean, you name it.
Yeah, recent vaccine, anything.
Yeah, and I should maybe make reference to my other book called Fauci's First Fraud. And Fauci's First Fraud, along with What the Nurses Saw, are they're sort of companion books. So in Fauci's First Fraud, I lay out the fraud of HIV equals AIDS equals guaranteed miserable death. Not true, by the way. It's a fraud. And then I showed, and then in What the Nurses Saw, I showed the ramifications of having that kind of primitive, anti-scientific, anti-medical, anti-human approach to medicine. And maybe we should get into what happened beyond the denial of anti-inflammatories and inhalable steroids.
Before you leave the Fauci's First Fraud, though, Fauci was involved, of course, in the AIDS crisis and now the COVID event, but he also took a couple of drugs that were useless, failed, expensive drugs in both cases that the pharmaceutical company had invested in and just kind of lost money in, pulled them off the shelf and used them, and they were responsible for a whole lot of the deaths, weren't they?
Yeah, there was a drug called AZT, which had literally been banned for human use. I mean, just, not contraindicated, but banned for human use. It was not even allowed to be used as to do medical research. And by some sleight of hand, next thing you know, AZT was the one and only acceptable cure if you got a positive HIV test. So here you've got someone maybe who's entirely healthy. They've been triggered. They've triggered a positive HIV test because of this technology, which we've talked about, PCR, which is entirely bogus from the point of view of a diagnostic. And now they're being told they're going to die a miserable death. And young people listening to this may not remember or may not know.
Right.
And those of us that were around and may forget, there was an nonstop barrage of terror. Who's that? Oprah Winfrey on her show, which I believe had 40 million viewers. That's a pretty big chunk of America. In the late 80s, she got on her show and told her audience, 1 of 5 of you are going to be dead from AIDS by 1990. So that's the level of terror that existed. So this thing was like a steady drumbeat of terror across all media. And then someone takes a test and they're told they're positive, which they were told meant they were going to die of AIDS. Mm-hmm. So in that climate, AZT was rolled out. And again, AZT was banned for human use. It's banned for human use because it's an extreme mutagen. It's an extreme carcinogen. And I know this sounds crazy, but, you can read the book. You can, do your own research. The side effects of AZT are exactly the side effects of one would have if one had a true case of AIDS. So they were literally giving people AIDS-like symptoms and killing them. And I know several people that died that way. I know one guy who got an HIV diagnosis and went home and blew his brains out. I mean, this was a really dark and evil and corrupt enterprise. And you know what? It's still going on. And, I mean, AZT is not being used anymore.
No, but Ken, I can just jump on with that because I was in the village in 91 and a girlfriend I'd had in 86. I bumped into a friend of hers and, hey, how you doing? Whatever. And she said, did you hear about Susan? I go, no, what? She goes, she died recently. I go, oh my God. She ended up dying of AIDS. And so I lived in terror before I could get an AIDS test. For 2 weeks.
Sure.
I had night sweats and all the things that they say are symptomatic with AIDS. I had them because I was so nervous. I was sweating at night. I wasn't sleeping. I go, oh my God, I must have it. And when I went in to get the test results 2 weeks later, they said, no, you're fine. But if they had said I had it, I would have said, oh God, what do I do? I was terrified. They had put such fear into people.
Sure. I was terrified too.
Terrified.
Until I have to go back to Gary Null until Gary started picking it apart. And even then, I tell you, it took months and months and months. I thought, oh, this Gary Null, he must be crazy, you know. And he was really swimming against the stream. Now, of course, everything he said back in the 80s is validated times 10.
Yeah. Ken, before you continue, I just want to tell the audience again, folks, we're talking to Ken McCarthy. He's the author of What the Nurses Saw. And three other books I'll mention: Fauci's First Fraud, The Unveiling of the COVID Con, The Nuremberg Codes. What the Nurses Saw, Ken, you have a subtitle, and I want you to defend this because it is powerful. The subtitle is An Investigation into the Systematic Medical Murders that took place in hospitals during the COVID panic and the nurses who fought back to save their patients. That's a pretty heavy statement. Can you defend that?
Yeah, it is. It is pretty heavy. And just so everybody knows, there's a website associated with this book called whatthenursessaw.com. So if people want to follow up with anything I've said, they can go to whatthenursessaw.com and they can order the book there, or they can just dive in deep. There's a lot of material on the website. In fact, it may be even more. It's an adjunct to the book of equal weight. There's a lot of additional material. So what is yeah? So I cover this in the book, but it's worth laying out now. So what is murder? Murder is doing something where the result is going to end in somebody else's death, right? I think that's a
sure,
fairly common sense definition of murder. There's accidents and so on and so forth. But if you know that doing A will kill somebody and you do A to them and they die, I think you committed murder. So I'm perfectly happy to give a pass in the early weeks to doctors and nurses who were told that they had to do certain protocols and that was the only way to treat COVID because, they were depending on the advice of their, leaders, their so-called leaders. But within days, and certainly within weeks, it was obvious these protocols not only didn't work, they actually killed. So if you continuously do something over and over and over again that kills people, you can't say it's an accident or you were misinformed anymore. And that's why I call these medical murders. And they took place in hospitals. And remember, you were not allowed, if you had a loved one in a hospital, you were not allowed to see them. You were not allowed to advocate for them. Even if you had a doctor to go in and advocate, he might not even been able to go in and do anything about it. So a lot of this took place behind closed doors. And again, the normal rules of medicine were completely suspended. There were nurses, there were veteran nurses, usually nurses that were above and beyond in terms of skill and experience level. I mean, one was a former combat veteran. Another had worked in Syrian refugee camps. People that really knew medicine and knew what serious medical conditions looked like, and they were willing to, risk. And they didn't just risk; they were willing to lose their jobs, and in some cases have their licenses challenged and lose their licenses in order to speak out against the unhinged abuses that took place in hospitals during COVID. And I have to say, after I wrote, you write a book, you research it, you write it, and then out it comes, and then your real education begins, because once the book came out, I'm getting, all kinds of letters from nurses, from family members, and as bad as I paint it in the book, and I'm not painting it to make it dramatic, I'm just reporting what the expert eyewitnesses saw. I'm not stretching anything. I'm just, here's what they saw, and here's how it's consistent across the country. But as bad as my book represents it, I learned that it was far worse. It was even worse than the book. So if you get the book and read it and go, my God, this is horrible, go to the website, because we have a lot of post-book interviews, and this thing was even darker than that.
Ken, I just want to repeat the website again. It's whatthenursessaw.com. Ken McCarthy we're talking to. I had a listener just call in and said you're presenting inaccurate information, and I would advise that listener to, or any listeners, you can email lookingglasswiox@gmail.com. That's lookingglass, one word, WIOX, all one word, at gmail.com. If you have any questions for Ken McCarthy. Ken wrote the book, What the Nurses Saw. He's interviewed dozens and dozens of healthcare professionals who were involved in the hospitals at this time, including respiratory therapists. And I have to say, their respiratory therapist interview, Mark Bishofsky, is just, all the interviews are so powerful. And I actually have a little clip of Nurse Erin, if we could play at some point. But I want you to continue, because you're doing great things here. You're giving a lot of information that people haven't heard. You've done a lot of research. And it's hard for people to hear these things.
I love these trolls that just pop out of nowhere and say you're presenting inaccurate information. Really? Have you read the book? Mm-hmm. Have you talked with the nurses? Have you talked with the families that put a relatively healthy person in the hospital and got somebody back in a body bag that was 50 pounds light with their organs destroyed? I mean, anyway. So yeah. I'm getting sick of the troll world. Mm-hmm. I'm going to tell you that right now. They are the banes of human existence. These people. If we want to talk fact against fact, fine. Right. That's a different story. But to throw this, generic, you're presenting inaccurate information, it's nonsense. I'm not going to be polite about it. So in addition to denying, so when you have a respiratory distress, the normal thing is you give the person an anti-inflammatory, and you give them inhalable steroids, and that can resolve it. And what people were getting who were going to the hospital with these kinds of respiratory problems, and they happened to get a positive COVID test, they were denied those basic things. So this is the equivalent of a fireman going to a house on fire, seeing that it's on fire, and saying, no water. I've been told no water. We've used water since the beginning of time, but we're not going to use water in this case. We're just going to sit and see what happens. Well, what happens if you don't treat something and the person's got an underlying weakness is it's going to get worse. And so this was the first major malpractice, systemic malpractice, not treating the problem. It doesn't matter whether it's COVID or pneumonia or whatever. You give people anti-inflammatories, you help them open their air passages. The next thing that they would do, and the order sometimes varied, is they'd put a BiPAP on somebody. And that's called non-invasive ventilation. So what is ventilation? Ventilation is when a machine breathes for you, mm-hmm. or assists your breathing. So BiPAP is a mask that it goes over your face very firmly. The air comes in really fast. If you want something equivalent, have somebody drive you around at 60 miles an hour and stick your head out the window. It's like that. It's uncomfortable. It can be anxiety-provoking. It's not something you do right away on somebody. You do it if it's, extreme situations call for extreme measures. So if it's required, you do it. But you do it with compassion. You advise the patient, hey, this is going to be hard. It's going to be a little scary. We're right here. We're going to take care of you. That's not how it was done in the COVID regime. Mm-hmm. This thing was slapped on everybody, and then they were left alone in the room.
Well, one of your nurses, Ken, talked about a doctor who wanted to ventilate a patient, and the patient said, well, I need to call my husband first to let him know. And she walked down the hall. She's talking on the phone. She came back into the room, and she's like, and in the meantime, the nurse is saying, well, if she's well enough to walk down the hall and make the call, I mean, is really a candidate for ventilation?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So I've been talking about the non-invasive form, and again, anxiety provoking. It will, a lot of people get agitated when they're anxious. And so then the doctors would say, well, you seem to be agitated. We'd like to give you a sedative. So they would start people on all these different sedatives. What do sedatives do? Again, this is not controversial. This is not new. This is textbook stuff. If you give somebody a powerful sedative, you will reduce their breathing capacity. So just to recap, no anti-inflammatory to knock down the inflammation. No inhalable steroids to help open up the passageways. Going right to the non-invasive first ventilation, which is an extreme measure, doing it callously, and then when the person is understandably upset, pumping them with sedatives, which reduces their breathing function. So then the next line would be, well, there is a treatment for this. It's called remdesivir. Now, a lot of people got hip to remdesivir after a while and realized this thing's killing people. Here's a history of remdesivir for the trolls out there. It was developed as an anti-Ebola drug. It was tested in Africa. It failed miserably. And one of the side effects of remdesivir is massive organ failure. Okay? Non-controversial, easy to look up. So what did Fauci do? Well, just like he took a banned drug, AZT, and again, nothing controversial about this history. AZT was a banned drug. It was not allowed to be used on human beings for any purpose, including research. And then remdesivir was failed. It was pulled off the market. It was not used for Ebola. And somehow it got magically resurrected to be used, not only to be used, but the only acceptable treatment for COVID. So if you had a COVID case and they didn't give you anti-inflammatories and they didn't give you inhalable steroids, and your case and your respiratory distress, whatever it might have been, because it could have been pneumonia, it could have been all kinds of things. There's this tragic story in the book about a relatively young man in his 30s who went in with a panic attack. And they vented him invasively, and I'll explain what that is in a second, and killed him. So then they would push the remdesivir. They would often lie about it. They would say, "Oh, it's not remdesivir. It's I can't remember the brand name, but there's another name remdesivir goes by. Oh, it's not remdesivir. It's Vercaline or whatever the other name is." In Canada, I got a report from a nurse that they were telling them that the remdesivir drips were actually vitamin C. I mean, the stuff that went on was insane, and we're going to talk about how this happened, the mechanisms of it, because that's an important part for people to understand. So they would try to get people to accept the remdesivir, and remember, they're alone. They're alone in a hospital. They have no physical contact with their loved ones or their advocates. They've been told they have a disease that's probably going to kill them, and they're surrounded by doctors and nurses, because believe me, not all the nurses were good, telling them that they needed to do this, they needed to do that. So remdesivir causes organ failure, and we have an interview with a fellow he examined every single death record in the states of Massachusetts and Minnesota. And he saw that as soon as remdesivir appeared on the scene, there was a spike in death records reporting death by organ failure.
Oh, boy. And
if you remember way back in the very early days of the COVID con, they were talking about how, oh, my goodness, COVID causes organ failure. Oh, no, a respiratory disease does not cause organ failure. Right. What was causing the organ failure was remdesivir, made by a company named Gilead. Now, if you want to connect this back to Fauci's mass murder, his previous mass murder experience, Gilead, I know you've probably heard of the COVID cocktails, you know, where they basically give you a little bit of this and a little bit of that and a little bit of this, right? Gilead makes, about a dozen of those. So there is a long relationship between Gilead, which is the maker of remdesivir, and Fauci. I do know that there is a system by which we, the taxpayers, pay for the medical research. The medical research is then made available to the drug companies. The drug companies then manufacture the drugs and, make their billions of dollars and pay a royalty back to the, quote, U.S. government. But who they're really paying the royalty back to is NIH. And they actually pay specific bureaucrats and researchers on the NIH directly. Some of it goes to the agency, but there are actual researchers and doctors who are getting working for NIH who get a royalty payment based on the use of a particular drug. Now, Senator Rand Paul had a long conversation, a public conversation with Fauci about this, and Fauci flat out, he acknowledged it, and he flat out refused to provide the details of who specifically was getting what money from what drugs. But we do know that Gilead, the maker of remdesivir, is very deeply involved with NIH and Fauci. There's a drug called Truvada, and you mentioned you grew up in you spent time in the West Village. You know, you then know the West 4th Street subway station, right?
Right, yeah.
Where the basketball courts are? Okay. And that long tunnel from the subway, from the tracks to the street?
Oh, yes, yep.
Okay. Well, I don't know what it's like now, but I remember walking through that tunnel one day, and every single ad was a Gilead ad for Truvada. Now, what's Truvada? Truvada is a cocktail that's taken, and this is so unhinged, I can't believe that it's allowed to go on. It's a prophylactic against AIDS, and the pitch is if you are at risk, in other words, if you're gay, you're probably at risk of AIDS, therefore you should start a course of Truvada now.
Is that the drug they call PrEP?
Yeah, I don't know the nickname they give it, but yeah, and it's made by Gilead, and I do know beyond a shadow of a doubt that drug is paying. Oh, what was it? I think don't hold me to the number, but I think it generates. I'm going to say this: tens of millions of dollars in royalties to NIH and certain NIH employees. That one drug alone, that's a Gilead thing. So this is one of the reasons. This is, if you wonder where remdesivir came from, why a failed Ebola drug, why a drug that is known to cause massive organ failure was the only acceptable treatment for COVID, I think now we know why. And now we go to the next piece of this. The federal government, in its wisdom, and I'm being sarcastic, said, well, hey, if you give courses, now not just a treatment, not just a single bag. By the way, this is a remdesivir is a bag, and it's given to you via intravenous, via a drip.
Mm-hmm.
So a course is multiple bags. Excuse me, I'm going to cough. The federal government was giving hospitals big bonuses for every remdesivir treatment that they they would give you a little bit if you gave one bag, but if you gave a full course, they'd give you more money. There's one case that I know, but I'm sure I could find more, of a family when they were reviewing the hospital records of their killed loved one. This guy had been given 3 courses of remdesivir, multiple bags 3 times. And every time the hospital ran a course of remdesivir, the cash register rang for them. And we're talking to the tune of thousands of dollars. So,
wow,
this is what happened. I mean, I'm not stretching anything. I'm not, exaggerating anything. This is literally what happened. So the next arsenal in the COVID treatment protocol was invasive venting. Invasive venting as opposed to non-invasive. So invasive, the nickname for the procedure, it's a pipe, and they stick it down your throat, down into your lungs, or it's big enough that they call it the garden hose. It's just sort of the shop jargon for it.
Right.
And you mentioned earlier, I interviewed a respiratory therapist. So this fellow, 24 years of sterling experience, probably one of the best in the business. If I had to have this procedure done, I would call him up and I'd fly him out to wherever I was and pay him to watch it. Basically, the doctors, insert the pipe down, and then there's a feeding tube as well. But in order to get this tube down your throat, they need to give you a barrage of drugs. They have to knock you out. They have to make you unconscious. They have to paralyze you. There are drugs called antiparalytics, and those keep you from moving because you don't want the person thrashing around with the equivalent of a garden hose down their throat. And then you have to give them analgesics. One analgesic is aspirin, but the one they use for this is fentanyl. and other very powerful painkillers. And these are not pills that you take once. These are all separate drips. So you might have anywhere from 5 to 12 different bags attached to you going into your system. And you're gone. You're out. It's kind of like anesthesia. And then the machine breathes for you. And the air is, basically forced down into your lungs. And that's how it works. Now, there's a couple of problems. First of all, this is an extreme procedure. And we should be glad that it exists, because there are conditions like a massive car accident or, some really severe thing where there is no breathing going on and that you cannot restore the person's breathing by any other means. Okay, at that extreme juncture, then you would invasively vent somebody. But here's what is known about this kind of ventilation. The minute you put somebody on that, the clock starts ticking. The longer they're on, the longer they're likely to have a bad result, up to and including death.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think through the logic of this, number one, there's potential of infection. Even with the greatest of care, you're sticking something down the throat that, the body's not designed to deal with stuff down the throat. So there's an infection risk. There's also the reality of you've got, 5 to 12 different pretty powerful drugs streaming through your system. That's not good for anybody, no matter how strong they are.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, these are weak people. That's why they're being invasively vented. How are you hydrated? You're not. The fluid in the drugs is considered to be sufficient hydration in a lot of places. How are you fed? Well, you're basically being fed sugar water. So the longer you're on that, if you're pre-diabetic or diabetic, you are, or even just a regular person, you are, undermining your health. How healthy is it to be motionless for hours, days, weeks at a time? Not healthy at all. We need to move around to stay healthy. So it is it's a treatment of last resort. The people that do it ideally are professionals, and we're going to talk about how professionalism went out the window during COVID. And here's the key. As soon as you invasively vent somebody, within 24 hours, you test them to see if they're strong enough to get off the vent.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because it's not healthy to be on a vent. That protocol was thrown out the window during COVID. You were on a vent, you stayed on a vent.
Why would they do that,
people,
Ken?
What's that?
Why would they do that? Why would they get rid of the most basic protocols that they've used for decades?
Because, number one, to rush somebody to an invasive vent was paid. It was bonused. The hospitals got money, big money, for every patient they had on a vent. And in a even more extreme degree of perversity, if they kept the person on the vent for 96 hours or more, they got another bonus. So they were paid to do it wrong. Mm. And here's the thing everybody needs to wake up to. Most hospitals, most doctors, and most nurses, not all nurses were heroic, went along with orders. They followed orders and did it. Now, where were these orders coming from? So we're going to complete the loop here. You think that the doctors and nurses run the hospitals, and in reality, they're the ones doing the work,
mm-hmm.
and that's on the day to day. But that's like saying the guy in the kitchen owns the restaurant. No, he doesn't. He's a hired hand. And the reality of medicine today is most people in the system are hired hands. So who are they working for? They're working for the hospital. And who runs the hospital? Some sort of great humanitarian that cares about human health? No, accountants run the hospitals. CFOs run the hospitals. Hospital administrators run the hospitals. They got the memo and went out to all the hospitals in America. Hey, if you put them on remdesivir, we're going to give you this. If you do multiple courses, we'll pay you for every course. If you put them on a invasive vent, we'll pay you this. If you keep them on for 96 hours or more, we'll pay you this. So the CFO and the hospital administrators let the doctors and the nurses know this is how it's going to be. And anybody who pushed back found themselves in a world of trouble.
In your book, what the nurses saw are usually from testimony from nurses who were there, either pushed back or just were witnesses and horrified and had to leave. And so if you have trouble with what Ken is saying, read the testimony of the nurses, the respiratory therapists, the medical professionals that are in the book, What the Nurses Saw by Ken McCarthy. Ken, continue.
Yeah, and the respiratory, everybody has a different job, obviously, and the job of the respiratory therapist is to manage somebody who's on an invasive vent. So they monitor it, they check the person's vitals, they test every 24 hours or even more frequently to see, hey, is this person strong enough? Can we take them off? Can they breathe on their own? And our informant, who's named, he's not Mark Bishofsky, again, 24 years of sterling experience, great record, and we went into a lot of technical detail in the book about what invasive venting means, and I've explained quite a bit of it already on this call. When I say technical, I don't mean we made it complicated. We took the complicated thing and made it understandable so that when people hear venting, now they know what venting means. Remember, in the early days, our disgraced New York governor, Cuomo, was pounding the table. We need vents.
We need 30,000 ventilators. I remember exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Now, there's a little problem with that, which someone should have told him. Vents are useless without respiratory therapists. It's like saying we need 10,000 cars, but we have no drivers. So here was the problem that took place in the New York City run hospitals in the early days, in the early months. Typically you would have a respiratory therapist manage 3 or 4, maybe a little more, but not many more patients because they require careful supervision. In the New York City hospitals during the COVID thing, they would have an entire floor of invasively vented patients with one respiratory therapist. It's impossible to manage that many patients, and so that was something that was done. The other big problem in the city hospitals, and I think this did happen in other parts of the country. They were bringing in contract nurses and contract doctors to manage the COVID wings or wards. Now, remember, once you were diagnosed with COVID based on this bogus test, you were put into a separate wing of the hospital, right? It was just COVID only. And there was a shortage of medical personnel. So they put out the call for contractors. Some of the contractors were incredibly capable. Some of the contractors, on the nursing side, they were taking nurses in the New York City hospital system during COVID who hadn't even finished their degrees. Okay? And they had nurses who had been degreed but didn't have the practical experience and didn't have ICU experience. And so there were a lot of people that did not know what they were doing in these COVID wards in New York City in particular. And these nurses were paid very well. The fee to go to New York City, believe it or not, was $10,000 per week, just for nurses alone.
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
And did that money come from the CARE Act, the trillion?
They opened the floodgates on the money. That particular money came from, I believe it was Homeland Security, and it was funneled through a handful, 2 or 3 different temp agencies, the equivalent of temp agencies for nurses. So, I always say that we really need an investigation this size of the 9/11 investigation, or the size of the Challenger disaster, or the size of the Kennedy assassination. I mean, we need dozens of full-time people looking into this because there's so many moving parts. But surely, I'm going to guess that those temp agencies had political connections, because the way a temp agency works is if the nurse is getting $10,000, the agency's getting thousands per nurse. They get a cut of that. Right.
So this is our tax money going to pay nurses extreme amounts of money who are often placed in like ICU where they're not trained for, or anywhere where they really may or may not have had the skill set to deal with it.
Absolutely, and it was the norm in the New York City hospitals and in the city-run hospitals that the staff did not have the correct expertise. So it doesn't matter how many vents you have or how many whatever you have. If you don't have trained hands that know what they're doing, it's going to be a disaster. And that's what Erin Olszewski was talking about in such great detail. And she wrote a book, and I'm sorry I can't remember the name of it, but if you go to what the nurses saw,
Undercover Nurse, I think.
Undercover Nurse.
Yes.
So she went into her experience. And then a couple of other nurses have written books on their personal experiences, and then some family members have written books on their personal experience. But until what the nurses saw came along, nobody had looked at it as a systemic problem. It was always viewed as a one-off, like, oh, look how bad it was in New York. Oh, look how bad it was in Minnesota. Oh, look how bad it was in Texas. So it was bad everywhere. Now, we talked about the nurses. The doctors were another case. They were bringing in doctors from overseas to take these contract positions, and they didn't necessarily have ICU experience. I mean, you had podiatrists, you had gynecologists working in the ICU. And I don't know what they were paid, but I'm sure it was a lot more than what the nurses got paid. Now, under normal circumstances, let's say you're the best doctor in Europe. Like you're world-renowned. Everybody comes to study with you because you're the genius of the age. If you come to the United States and try to practice medicine, you can't. You have to go through a whole series of hoops, no matter how qualified you are to practice medicine in the United States. It's a pretty good system, I guess. I mean, I think if somebody's super qualified in Germany, they're probably going to be a good doctor in the United States. But that's our system. You don't just get off the plane and start practicing medicine. Under COVID, they suspended that. Anybody from anywhere who had an MD or who claimed they had an MD, who could fog a mirror, could be hired as a contract doctor in an ICU, regardless of their specialty.
What were doctors paid, Ken? I know you said nurses are getting
that I don't know. You know, okay. I focus so much on the nurses, but I'm going to guess if a nurse was getting $10,000 a week, again, not a month, a week, the doctors must have been paid quite more. So, you know, imagine the problem here. You've got doctors that are not part of the community. They're not even part of the country. And I'm not xenophobic or anything, but they know they're going to get on a plane and go back to wherever they came from. They're being paid lavish amounts of money. By the way, the U.S. is one of the only places in the world where doctors are paid as highly as they are. There's a lot of places in the world where you don't get paid that much to be a doctor. So imagine the temptation of somebody who's been flown from another country, they've been given a pass, they're allowed to practice medicine in the United States, they're being paid lavishly, and they're being told, follow orders. These are the orders, follow them. So the nurses that I interviewed were nurses who, you know, at least a decade of experience, some multiple decades, really skilled, really qualified, who looked at this in horror and pushed back. So now when they pushed back, hospital administrator or one of their henchmen would tell them, you either shut up or you're out of here. And if they wouldn't shut up, they were out of there. And then there was another element to this. There was a group called Team Halo, basically a group of organized thug trolls. Believe it or not, I know this sounds crazy, but this is all documented. It's in the mass media. Team Halo was enabled by the UN Undersecretary of Communication. We have a whole chapter on that in the book. And they made an alliance with these trolls and TikTok. And basically, if you were a member of Team Halo, you could say and do anything. You had a blank check. You know, the rest of us, if we get one, you know, comma out of place, we're banned for life. You know, I'm exaggerating, of course, but this group was given a free pass, and they were allowed to go out, and they were initially, it was supposed to be to encourage people to get vaccinated. And then to, you know, engage in debate with those who were, you know, against it. But it evolved very quickly into a mob and into personal attacks and even doxing against specific doctors and specific nurses. So if you were one of the nurses who dissented from the systemic mass murder of patients in hospitals during COVID using a protocol that everyone needs to understand this. The protocol they used to treat this inflammatory lung condition or breathing condition had no basis in medical history, had no basis in science, and defied all common sense. And it was killing people left and right. And we should talk about how many people it may have killed.
Well, before you do, you have a number in the book, and I think you probably got this from statistical sources, but 92% of COVID deaths happened in either hospitals or institutions?
Yeah.
A lot of people had thought when it first erupted, I thought the homeless are going to get ravaged in New York. These poor people are on the street. It's cold, it's wet, and they didn't seem to suffer. And it seemed like most people who suffered were in hospitals, and that sort of supports the thesis of what the nurses saw, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, in addition to the homeless, and that's another issue, there was no outbreak of COVID among people in the homeless population, including people living really rough, living on the street, literally. But there's another population that no one's ever talked about, which is the elderly. It's a sad fact of life that there are a lot of isolated elderly people living alone, without much social support. Given that all respiratory diseases have a huge impact on the frail elderly. You're frail. You're not. Your immune system's not all there. You don't have a support system in place to take care of you if you are sick. There should have been many elderly people dying at home alone, sadly, during COVID. Didn't appear to happen. Where it appeared. So when we know that over 1 million people are said to have died of COVID, and 92% of them died in a hospital or some other healthcare setting, we're looking at 900,000 plus people. That's the number. And so the question, I don't have the answer, and no, we will not have the answer until the federal government or the Congress there's no news media organization that's going to care enough to make the investment until somebody makes a significant investment in figuring out how many of the people who, quote, died of COVID died of systemic medical malpractice. We're starting with a pool. Yep. We're starting with a pool of over 900,000.
Folks, this shows Through the Looking Glass here on WIOX Radio at 91.3 FM and MTC Cable Channel 20, and you can hear us everywhere at WIOXradio.org. We've been talking to Ken McCarthy for the hour, author of What the Nurses Saw. You can go to his website, whatthenursessaw.com. Ken, is there anything else you'd like to close with in 20 seconds or so?
Okay, anybody that goes to a hospital, for whatever reason, needs to have a strong advocate. One of the things we have in the book are resources of commercial companies that provide medical advocacy. I would say nobody should go into a hospital for any reason without having somebody watching your back. This is not a problem related just to COVID. COVID made it extreme, but everybody needs an advocate when they go to the hospital.
Ken McCarthy, What the Nurses Saw, available on Amazon and also at his website, whatthenursessaw.com. Ken, thanks so much for coming on and sharing your research with our audience so much.
Thanks for having me.
All right. All the best to you, sir.